This is chapter 5, and yes, this is the exact same shirt I wore in all the intros for all the videos, and that's really because I shot all those intros and outros on the exact same day. So, cat's out of the bag. Today's episode, I'm going to cover databases inside of a WordPress plugin setup. We're going to look at how do we set up databases at the moment our plugin gets activated, how do we clean that out the moment it's gone, and we're also going to be looking at admin menus. How do we kind of set up an admin menu where we can display this data, and also the pages so we can interact with that, and what do we need to be aware of in terms of registering those hooks for our plugin. Hope you enjoy this. I'll see you inside of the video. So we're going to be looking at a couple of things like inside of this one. We're going to be looking at creating custom databases. We're going to be looking at standard CRUD operations inside of that. How do we, sanitization and validation. We're always going to be doing that. And we're going to be looking at the core database functions for operating with the database, like which one is used in what case and why you should know them. We're going to look at some kind of security practice around this, and we're going to basically build a setup that the moment a user activates your plugin, it sets up some database, populates that with some information that you can then reference and pull based upon what we've learned. And then also when they deactivate your plugin, so it goes and removes that database table and clears up a little bit of what it's done kind of in the past. Now, I'm not going to cover necessarily things like logging options and having those as references, especially because I'm showing you over the table. But I mean, if you're interested in those, just let me know. So let me first show you like what we're actually going to be working on. We've got our little kind of test dummy site that we've got up here, and I've got our plugin here. So I'm going to go ahead, and first before I do it, I've got phpMyAdmin open up here, and we can see the current database. I'm just going to refresh it so you can show this is not a magic trick. These are just standard default when you're first setting up a WordPress kind of table. We're reading on that side. Okay, so I'm able to kind of play with that. You can modify that, and now again, if I go to my plugin again, and I go to the plugin and I go now and deactivate that plugin. And I go again and I refresh the database. You can see now that table is gone. All right, so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to kind of get that up and going so you're kind of familiar with that and you can expand your plugin with a little bit more control for yourself. So the global variable that we want to import inside of WordPress is the wpdb variable. That's the global variable we want to kind of bring in and utilize inside of our script or our class in order to get access to the primary functions. Now, there's some certain core functions that you really want to be utilizing when you're doing this, and that would be the prefix function, right? So we can use that WP, and out of it, we can get the prefix out of that. And that's basically going to tell us, again, if we're looking at the database tables, we can see, like, for example, this was KGMBNC. So that, again, when you're setting up WordPress, you're going to pick a unique configuration for that. So that allows us to find that so that when we create our tables, we can reference that correctly. Then it's the standard kind of CRUD functionality, the insert, the update, the delete, and then the get results, which gets multiple rows, and the get singular row, and then get a single, or get var, which is getting a single value out of the database table. Also, then we also have the ability to do queries on that, which allows us to basically write raw SQL for our queries to the database. Then we have the prepare statement. And the prepare statement is essentially like the better choice if you are going to be taking user inputs. That'll prepare the statement, again, that'll pre-validate it and process it so that we're making sure that we're getting rid of any kind of SQL injections that might be inside of it. And then the last is the get character collate. That essentially is going to be just what's the proper character set and collision of the table and the things that we're working with. There's three kind of standard data tables that you get, right? So again, if we're looking back at what we had initially here, these are the kind of WordPress standard ones. And we can really kind of break that down as the core tables, and then the meta tables. So there's the core tables and the meta tables that carry the relationship and the extra metadata. And then there's the custom tables, which will be created by any plugin that you install that wants to run its own thing, including your own. Let's get into it and let's walk through some of the functions. Okay. So if I go here, theme, so the moment the user switches a theme from one or another, I'm going to run my create custom templates. Now, I won't use that in a real world scenario. That's why I've got these activation and deactivation hooks in the front. But just as an example, in that you can fire this off with any other hook the way you would normally do it. Okay, so if I go into this one, let's look at the kind of core functionality inside of that. Again, there's the global WPD variable, first thing you want to declare inside of it. And then from there on, if I'm going to define this table name that I'm going to do, which is the HTH underscore custom table, I want to kind of append to that I want to kind of pre-paint that, with the actual prefix that I can then get from that global variable. So that way I know my table's naming convention is going to be correct. And now I want to get the character coalition because I'm going to need that, especially when I'm using a raw SQL in order to create my table and so that I can set up a proper table statement. So this is a standard SQL query that you would write. I'm inheriting the table name, so I've got the conventions, and I'm inheriting the character set collate so that I've got the exact character set. And then the very important one, you don't need this with everyone, but you cannot create a database with the standard create functions. So these standard dbDelta functions don't have that kind of privilege. You cannot create database tables with them. In order for you to do that, you need access to the dbDelta function. And the dbDelta function sits in the upgrade file inside of the includes of WordPress. So you're going to have to require that upgrade file. Again, you can do it wherever you want to. I'm just doing it here because I don't have any other use cases where I use it. And then from that, I can get the wpdb and then I can execute my MySQL query. Now, obviously, in a real-world scenario, you may want to assign the results of that to a variable, and you want to maybe do some error checking or logging around that, but you'll already know how to do logging and things like that. And that's it. That's as simple as it is for you to go ahead and create your table. Now, you can obviously fire this into a variety of different actions. So I'll look at the inserts and all those others in a moment. But if I just go for the sake of clarification here, there's my register activation hook. And this is essentially what I'm connecting or creating. So if I go and I go search for that, I've got a function, and all this function does, it actually runs that function that we just defined. So it's going to go ahead and create my table on the activation. And then I've got another one here that we will look at, which is essentially just putting dummy data inside of that. That was those 3 rows that you saw. And we'll look at that now. And then I actually want to kind of set something in the options table. And this is just for my own reference, right? Because I may need to check this up in the future, because maybe I've got a database version and I've got multiple plugins, or the user had one of my plugins and maybe my database table has, gotten very different from that version, and I need to warn them that the changes are going to be so dramatic because it's a major version upgrade, maybe not a security badge. So when I do that, I want to make sure that I am kind of, in this case, you don't need to, this is just what I think is a good practice. I'm going to add an options, and you can always get options. It's just a nice way with standard WordPress tables. It's always going to be there. I'm going to create one for my plugin, and I'm going to give it the version stamp of my plugin. And then I'm just going to note that the user has actively created my database table inside of it at this timestamp. Because now I know I can remove that, I can create that, and again, they've just got logic. They've got the plugin, it's this version, and they've actually gone and created the database. It was successful. So I've got that information so I can do something with it in the future. Now, the same thing as you've got here for the deactivation plugin, all I'm doing here is I'm running slightly something similar. I'm not firing off those functions. I'm just again inheriting the global variable here on that. Now, for this, I can use the query function. I do not need to use the dbDelta. The dbDelta is only for creating new tables, or that's really the only place you're mostly going to be using it. And then I just want to clean up the plugin data because the user no longer has my plugin in. It's been deactivated. They no longer have the tables. So I can go in and use the delete underscore options for the add underscore options to go and remove those options from that table. So I no longer have to check for those things. They're cleaned up. All right. And that's as simple as it is. Like, that's the fundamental basics of creating a database table when you set up your plugin and how to remove it. Now, there's a few more things that we want to just be aware of as we're doing that. So let's kind of look a little bit about what that is. Starting at the top, we're basically just going to look at your standard queries. I'm going to go through this so you kind of understand them, and we're not spending too much time on these. You can start seeing the pattern here. I'm doing these create, like this is an insert. I'm passing 2 values to it. And with these 2 values, again, normal, I'm getting my table, so I've got the right reference. I'm building an array for what I'm going to be working with. Now, this is just a kind of a good practice when you're passing this in with the inserts, right? So if you look at an insert, whenever you want to do, obviously you're going to sanitize, you're going to do all of that kind of good value stuff, but you essentially have 3 core parameters that you're going to get from it. So firstly, it's the name that you want to insert. In other words, it's the column name. So in the second one, it's just value that's going to be linked to that column. And that's going to basically return you either a row or it's going to give you a Boolean of false if it didn't insert, if there was an issue. Now, with the data format, this is just a good practice to kind of pass in because you're defining the data format for kind of type safety that you're doing there. And that's the optional third option. Okay, and you get a Boolean back if it's a failure. So I can just check if it's not false. Then I can return using the insert underscore ID property on that wpdb to get the actual ID of that row that's now just been inserted. Now, let's just say, as you saw in the opening example, I not only created the table, I used this insert function that we just said to actually insert some data. Now, I want to fire that off immediately, and that was the second function that you saw inside of that, which was this HTH check and insert initial data. So inside of that, again, the global variable, I'm again defaulting my table. Again, you can obviously set these in any way that you want. I'm just doing them piece by piece for clearer lessons. I'm defining a get var here where I'm basically trying to return a single value from the experience. Okay, so in other words, does this table exist, right? I'm not looking for a lot of things. Show tables like my table. So does my table exist? Is it actually there? And then I can just check against that. So I can use the get var to get a singular value back. If this table name is going to be matching my table name, I'm going to get a match back. And from there on, all I'm really doing in this example is I'm just doing some good kind of like housekeeping. I'm basically just checking what's the count of the tables. I'm expecting a singular value. That's really why I'm using the get var. So if I get a singular value back and the count of those tables is going to be higher than 0, then I know data's already been populated in that, and then I don't want to insert my dummy or my test data. Because maybe, there was a cleanup or, the plugin was removed in another way. Maybe the user just went in the backend or the code and they went and deleted the plugin, so your deactivation hook never fires, or maybe an update happened and it caused failure, and then that step never occurred. So you don't want to rerun that, otherwise you're going to have duplicates of your dummy data. So again, just really considering getting into those habits. So I'm checking, is there any rows? And then I'm just going to go and compare that, like if it really is 0. And then I'm going to go and use my HTH, the insert custom data that I just had. And all I'm doing is I'm passing it the name of values, like any kind of standard function. So that's it. It's that simple to go ahead and create some stuff. So when it comes to actually reading information, there's a couple of ways we can do it. Not only can we use the get results to essentially get an array of all the items, we can also kind of filter it like with array underscore B, object, or array in, if we're depending on how we want that data. And then you also have a couple of other ones that you can use on that. Instead of the get results, if you want all the results, maybe you just want a single row, you're going to use get row. If you want a single column from that list as an array, you're just going to use the get column, which is another option. And then again, if you're just looking for a single value like we did in the previous example there, you're just going to use get var. And so you just have a basic understanding, like if we look at like a get, like an array A, this is going to give us an associative array back. And if we look at a get, and if we're passing in an array underscore n, this is going to give us a numerical array back in terms of that. All right, so we've got our, get custom data function here. I'm just then doing some normal kind of affairs to do my own kind of like checks on this. For example, in this case, I'm passing in a limit option for amount of records. I'm passing in a flag that I want to order this by. And in this end, this is very similar to how you might want to gather your data or read variables when you're doing sorting of columns and things like that. And then I'm building up my SQL query based upon that. I'm checking if there is a limit, and if so, then I'm appending it to my query. And now I've got my SQL query the way I want it. And now I'm going to be using the get results, and that's going to be getting me all the kind of data. Now, again, naturally, if you want to do it by ID, you're going to just pass an ID into whatever your function is and make sure that's available so you can fire that off of a hook or an action or a form submission or anything like that. And again, just in this case, maybe instead of getting get results, you might want to use get row just to get a single result back from that. If I'm going to be doing a search against the database, I want to have a little bit more security around that stuff. So that's super, super important, because a search is going to be a variable that either a user is going to pass in, or maybe there is a convention that happens inside of a categories group or something like that. Now, we have no idea what kind of character sets are going to be inside of that. So there is the possibility of a security risk inside of that. So when we are going to be doing something like that, I still want to get my results and I still want to get them back as an associative array. I'm just going to do two kind of additional things. Well, it's really up to you. And then we use the prepare statement so that I can essentially make sure that there's nothing, dodgy there. SQL injections are taken care of. And the same thing when I'm taking that search term that's passing in for me, especially because I'm doing a wildcard, you don't want to have similar characters that's not going to break your wildcard search. So you can use the escape like statement. And the escape like statement will help you handle those kind of edge cases. Okay, so next up is our update function. Now, the update function takes 5 specific parameters. It takes the table, it takes the data that we're actually going to change, it takes the where condition, so the ID or so where of what we want to kind of affect. It takes the format for it to understand what the format is of the object of the data that it's getting, and then it looks for a format of our where statement, especially if our where statement has multiple conditions inside of it. So let's look at that quickly. So I've got my updates custom function here. And again, you've got those if you pull the code. And that's going to return essentially a successor value Boolean for us. So here's just a little bit of kind of values. I'm firstly just checking, is that actually an integer? This is just some housekeeping. I'm validating the input because I'm going to expect that I'm going to get what passes into this function is going to be the value and the name that I'm changing and the details that I need to update. So I'm going to firstly kind of create my data in terms of that. And there I'm doing, again, sanitization. I'm just, grabbing maybe the current timestamp of my, or however you want to do that. That's really up to you and how your database is set up. So I'm just preparing my data. And then I'm defining my where condition. So my where condition I'm going to be passing in as an array. And I'm basically setting it's my ID and it's equal to the ID that I've now sanitized. And then I'm basically just defining the data formats for type safety. So same thing as we did earlier with inserts, type safety is a little bit of an important thing. So I'm expecting that I'm going to be passing in a data with 3 kind of variables, and my where format is going to have 1. So you obviously can do a little bit more of that, like reading strings or insert things like that. So all I'm really defining here is I'm just basically telling WordPress, like, this is the data type and this is the amount of values that you're going to be getting. So if you're not familiar with these, like S is any kind of type of string, like a varchar or a text and so on. A D is for an integer, so that could be anything from an int to a big int to a tiny int. And then an F would be any kind of float type of data or a double or a decimal that you may use. So I want to just basically tell it, like, this is the amount of values you're expecting and these are the data types that they're going to be. So I've got that kind of sanitized. So again, something you definitely want to consider if you're working between formats, like if you're passing JSON data through an API versus data that's just coming directly from the application. And then there you go. You just want to go ahead and insert that. And again, just the order. It's the name of the table. It's the data that you've now prepared that you're inserting inside of your table. It's your where condition. So what is the ID essentially, as an array, and like multiples, because you're going to define that based upon the order of the where format that you're passing in. Hence the name value pair if it's an ID, so that you'll have your column name as the name, and then you have your value as that. So a name value pair. And then finally, your format. So that would be firstly the format for your data, and the second one is the format for your where statement. So that's that one. Next up is deletes. So delete's probably going to be the simplest of them all in that sense, where you have the delete function, obviously, and then you've got 3 values that this one really kind of expects, which is what is the table name, as usual, and what is the where clause. So what's the ID, or what is it by which we're doing it? And then, again, for that sanitization, what is the format? So again, if we look at those, we have the wpdb delete method that we're going to be using. And again, it accepts an array for the where condition, and obviously same for the formats. So you can condition that on multiples as with all of them. And then you're just going to pass delete to it, name where, and you're going to get the exact same thing back. It's going to be a false Boolean if it failed. So like another example is we don't just have to do it with the normal kind of delete function. Maybe you've got some logic. Maybe you want to, reset the auto incrementation, and that's really what you want to do, or you want to do something else on a conditional statement that really goes into that. And you can then create custom queries based upon that logic as per usual. All right, so in this case, all I'm doing is I'm passing in an order increment for it. Do I want to reset it or not? And then if so, just go ahead and reset and truncate the table. Otherwise, use the delete. So I can still use the query to modify things on that, but for creation, it's a bit of a different story. Okay, last but definitely not least, Now that we've got all of that, we obviously want to add it into the admin area and have a little page for where we can configure that the way we showed in the beginning of the video. So this is kind of two functions that we really have to knock off. So firstly is our display function, or rather secondly, it's our display function. So let's kind of just go down to the actual adding an item to the menu. So the way we're going to add an item to the menu is with the admin_menu hook. And then we give it our callback function. Now here's where the magic really happens. So inside of the callback function, we essentially have some core information that we need to pass through to it, obviously, which is the page title, the menu title, the actual kind of capabilities that this is supposed to have, and then the unique menu slug that we want to give this area of ourselves or this area of our app. And then, of course, the actual callback. And the callback is going to be responsible for displaying that page and handling any kind of logic or layout that we really want to do. And then our icon, like what icon we want to use from the dash icons. So we can use our icon and inject that in there. And then the last kind of value here is really the position that we're going to go after. And to really kind of get a sense of where that is. So if we want to get something around where the posts are, so anything about from 5 to 10, or so 5 to 9 is really going to be this place. So I want to put this just after the default posts. So 6. So this is kind of the common positions. Now, don't take this as gospel. This can change because of other plugins in there. It can change because of versions and everything else like that. But at the time of this recording, this is pretty much a safe guess because we're going to get the dashboard, the posts, then the media thing. So if you want to kind of have your plugin further down, you want a separator between it, then you can put a higher number of 100 for way at the bottom. Or if you want it closer to the tools or the plugins or any kind of area like that. So that's really what this number digit is for. So that's it. We're just calling the add_menu page and then passing in these parameters. And now, obviously, that's going to show it up in the menu, but then our callback has to actually do something. So let's look at the callback quickly. So just before we kind of look at the callback, again, some housekeeping. Because of how you don't really have full control over the app or over the layout or the rules of the template designer, especially if you're making a plugin that's going to be available on the marketplace. So just make sure that you're escaping your HTML or attributes, URLs. If you got JavaScript that's going to be there as well, you can escape those, especially if you're looking back and forth from forms. Like if you got a text area for special characters. We talked about cases previously about allowing certain HTML tags. And then there's case specifically for a post that allows post content HTML tags to be in it. Okay, so then here's our function. So essentially what we've got here is we've got our function from earlier, which was our get custom data, where we're just basically calling the data that we're actually going to show out in this field. So in case you forgot, that's up here where we just pass in those parameters. We got the global variable, we called the table, and we just got all the data out of that table. So now here, all we're doing is we're checking, well, if this is not empty, so if we've got some data actually in here, then we're just going to use echo essentially to echo out our HTML form, essentially inside of that. And that's basically the chunks of it. So then we can also obviously have an else condition if we don't see the thing that we want to see, and we can add that logic in. And then naturally, we can now go ahead and include, for example, it's not included in this one, because this is just to kind of demonstrate it for you, because I'm sure you know how to write your own JavaScript. But here I've just got an on edit and an on click with some logic there that it can handle those specific cases. Now, again, because I've gotten my data, I've passed it in, I've checked that it's not empty, I've built up my form, and now I'm basically looping over the data that I've got, creating the rows for this table. And that's why you saw the 3 tables or the 3 rows earlier in the beginning of the video. And I'm just outputting the data. Again, I'm escaping the HTML that might be coming from those fields that might be stored in it. And I'm just making sure that I have what I need for the on-call. Now, obviously, you'll flesh this out. You'll echo out your JavaScript here, or you'll use WP enqueue scripts, whether it's just enqueue scripts or enqueue scripts in the admin, in order to actually load that up. And there you go. That's how you very quickly set up an admin area. Just get that HTML guy. Again, you can do this yourself. Otherwise, if you're lazy, just get ChatGPT to do this redundant, like echoing out of a basic HTML table for you, and you are good to go. Okay, cool. Well, that covers that one. I think now you've got all of the fundamental skills to kind of get you started in building custom plugins for WordPress. Now, obviously, the sky's the limit of where you can go with this kind of stuff, and there are many other topics. We can still talk about enqueue scripts, putting that in different kind of areas, so we manage especially custom JavaScript. We can be talking about, for example, self-updating plugins. We can be talking about how do we integrate with other big brand plugins that are out there, how do we get onto the WordPress market, and all those other areas. If you are interested in it, these are things that will be covered in the Technomancer program, but I'm happy to do some tutorials, get some custom things. Please pop a question down below or give me some ideas on topics that you'd like to see me cover next time, and maybe even some styles of ways that you'd like to do it. I've been toying around with this idea, as I said, for live coding sessions where I kind of debug and you kind of get some of my thinking in terms of that, or I maybe help you with some of your code. Give me your feedback. I'd love to hear from you, and I will see you in a future video.